members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. I also acknowledge the presence of the former Defense Secretary in our midst. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a number of comments on the UN Human Rights Council resolution entitled Promoting Reconciliation, Accountability, and Human Rights in Sri Lanka, adopted on the 1st of October 2015. I'm going to stick to my text for two reasons. One is time is rapidly disappearing, and secondly, since this is a fairly technical subject, I would like to stay close to the technicalities. Prior to the adoption of the resolution in 2015, the Human Rights Council adopted 3 resolutions on Sri Lanka, which were against us. The year before that, we had a resolution which was resoundingly in favor of Sri Lanka. But the 3 resolutions that were adopted against us witnessed a diminishing number of votes in favor of Sri Lanka. Interestingly and intriguingly, with the change of government, Sri Lanka decided to co-sponsor the 2015 resolution. The key objective of the new government in co-sponsoring the resolution appears to be to accommodate the wishes of its main sponsors and appease them, with a view to ending the increasingly bitter confrontation that was developing between them on the one side and Sri Lanka on the other. Earlier, with the gradual deterioration of the bilateral relationship and the slow motion drift away from each other, the US began to take the lead in driving the resolution critical of Sri Lanka. Starting in 2012, a country that was once considered a warm friend of Sri Lanka was now acting in an outright hostile manner. This is interesting because politically, the US was going as far away as possible from Sri Lanka, and it was creating a situation that was difficult for us to manage from this end. On the other hand, many of you will remember that the US did assist us militarily, and in some critical areas too. The US's lead was followed by the UK and Canada, and we saw the performance of the UK at the CHOGM, and then Canada, which did not even attend CHOGM at a senior level, was equally vicious in its attacks on Sri Lanka. Of course, the combination resulted in something that could be foreseen. The US, with its diplomatic missions in a majority of countries of the world and extensive economic and military clout, had the type of diplomatic influence that could overpower many challenges. Sri Lanka decided to confront the US at the Human Rights Council and oppose the resolutions. Sri Lanka did not have the diplomatic and financial muscle to take on the US head-on. The US was able to ensure that India, despite its long-standing proximity to Sri Lanka, joined those who would vote against us. And Sri Lanka, by far, was not even the worst offender in the international arena to incur the wrath of the international human rights lobby groups and the leading Western countries. However, once the decision was made in Colombo to confront the US, the diplomats gamely spearheaded Sri Lanka's campaign. Unfortunately, the US position continued to harden, and Sri Lanka was getting pushed into the same basket of usual suspects reserved for the states regularly blacklisted by Washington: North Korea, Burma, Iran, Belarus, and Cuba. Of course, the term used to refer to Myanmar, by the West at the time was Burma, the old name. This was an unfortunate development in the bilateral relationship with the United States. Could this change in the relationship be explained in a simple manner? Much more research will need to be done in this aspect. In my mind, one thing was very clear. It was not only the possibility that the Sri Lankan forces may have committed human rights violations that drove Washington to spearhead a campaign to demonize Sri Lanka and its leadership. There were other more likely candidates for this demonic label of really nasty states. In my view, there were political and personal goals and prejudices at play as well. The three human rights champions of Washington, all three are women, and most of you are familiar with the names, may have decided to pick on Sri Lanka for their own reasons. Iraq, Afghanistan, and definitely Israel were no-go areas for any American official with ambition. You do not touch these countries where the US was directly involved or had direct ties with if you wanted a career in the administration. Iran and Syria were a waste of time because the countries concerned were in the habit of ignoring Washington's agonized complaints about human rights violations. These two countries had resolutions adopted against them on a regular basis, but as regularly, they ignored those resolutions. Sri Lanka was always in the limelight, thanks to an array of human rights organizations that targeted the country regularly, and a good country to be taken to task. The media could not get enough of the bad side of Sri Lanka. Channel 4 made it a habit to produce a heart-wrenching documentary on Sri Lanka annually and intriguingly prior to the Human Rights Council sessions. Channel 4 seemed to popularize the view that Sri Lanka was the nastiest of all these bad human rights violators. Most importantly, Sri Lanka seemed to take the bait and respond as expected. Was it a game? In a sense, it was. Personal confrontations and prejudices most certainly encourage powerful individuals in the West to strive for the kill in Sri Lanka. And it has to be remembered that in diplomacy, personal relationships matter. You create a personal enemy, that person is going to move heaven and earth to get at you and your country. You make a friend, the converse is also true. Sri Lanka, for its part, may not have adequately addressed some of the allegations or orchestrated its message contradicting the Channel 4 documentaries, the media stories, and the perceptions that were mounting. There was considerable opportunity to do so. Significantly, well-resourced LTT support groups kept up the anti-Sri Lanka campaign using influential members of the Western political establishment and the media. The possibility of orchestrating a regime change may have entered the minds of the powerful in the West. What are the consequences of co-sponsoring the resolution for Sri Lanka? First, it must be remembered that a resolution of the Human Rights Council is not binding. There is no obligation on the part of the target country to give effect to such a resolution. A Human Rights Council resolution is binding on the UN the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and his Secretariat, but not on member states of the United Nations. One must remember that even a resolution of the United Nations is not binding. The freedom of action of the High Commissioner pursuant to a Council resolution is limited by what the target country would allow him to do within its jurisdiction. The impotence of the High Commissioner has been demonstrated in a practical sense, time and time again, by countries which were targets of Council resolutions. There are many such resolutions and reports produced by the High Commissioner, which are gathering dust in the Secretariat simply because the target countries have refused to cooperate? Are there possible consequences for non-compliance with the Council resolution? The Council is not empowered to impose penalties on a recalcitrant state, but the matter of a serious violator of human rights could be raised at an appropriate UN agency with punitive powers, such as the UN Security Council. Given the political nature of the Security Council, it takes considerable effort to get approval for any sanctions initiative, even if the other requirements of the Charter are satisfied. Those with powerful friends are always shielded in the Council. I don't need to name names, you just have to read the papers, and you see the violations that are taking place around the world, even as we speak, and the UN Security Council does nothing, simply because it hasn't the ability to do anything, or because it isn't allowed to do what it may want to do, or other members want to do. It will also, the Security Council will also not set a precedent that could make lives difficult for its members, especially the P5. It was not without reason that the West did not bring the matter of alleged human rights violations in Sri Lanka before the UN Security Council, although I am beginning to hear rumors that this may no longer be the case at the moment. But these are only rumors. Sri Lanka opted to co-sponsor the 2015 resolution, while not creating a legal obligation, certainly creates at least a powerful moral obligation to implement its provisions. But moral obligations in the international arena belong to a gray area. Many states give effect to them in bits and pieces, yet others simply let them drift into history, and others may implement them to suit their own circumstances. Having said that, one could argue that a country's credibility would depend on complying with the obligations it has voluntarily undertaken. And we've heard a number of comments this evening on the voluntary nature of the obligations Sri Lanka undertook by co-sponsoring that resolution in Geneva. In the international area, it is not advisable to walk away from voluntarily adopted obligations. It is possible that a country which is not obliged to comply with a resolution to be talked into complying, yes, or it could convince itself into complying. This may be happening in Sri Lanka today. A stream of Western dignitaries and the UN Secretary General have visited the country and given copious advice on the value of complying with the UN Human Rights Council resolution. Some would say that considerable pressure has been applied on Sri Lanka. The visitors have included the Secretary of State, John Kerry. The UN Secretary General, having resisted visiting Sri Lanka since the end of the conflict during the Rajapaksa presidency, decided to drop in with only 4 months left of his tenure of office, perhaps to add weight to the efforts of those trying to convince Sri Lanka to comply with the resolution. It is more than likely that he received a nod and a wink from Washington before he undertook this journey. Intriguingly, the Secretary General apparently has given an assurance that he will have the resolution implemented. Is this another occasion that he simply shut off his mouth without appreciating the gravity of what he was saying? His powers of implementation are only illusory. As Foreign Minister Lavrov once observed, when he was ambassador in New York and was requested not to smoke in the building on the orders of the SG, the Secretary General is no general, just a secretary. He continued to smoke. Compliance with the resolution, we are told, is the passport to enter the heaven of acceptance provided by the international community. As the good father said, in reality, a small group of Western countries whose economic and military clout in the world may not be as significant as it used to be. In parallel, elements of the opposition continue to harp on the dangers of the UN Human Rights Council resolution, forcing the government to defend itself ever so vigorously and its efforts to comply with it. Thus, we have the ideal combination of circumstances, both external and internal, conducive to giving effect to the resolution. Madam Chair, if you would allow me 3 more minutes, I will wrap up. It is noted that many of the UN Human Rights Council country-specific resolutions adopted by majority vote remain unimplemented. Many resolutions targeting the bad apples, as identified by the so-called international community, have been regularly adopted by the UNHRC and are regularly ignored. We have the usual targets such as North Korea, Syria, Iran, and Belarus in this category. Israel gets targeted regularly by the majority of the membership of the Council, while some members of the international community abstain or vote against the resolutions on Israel. Myanmar has escaped the basket of bad apples and has been asked to pay a relatively small price for its newly acquired status. The real question is whether much has changed in the behavior of the bad apples as a consequence of the adoption of the UNHRC resolutions and increasingly shrill cries of the human rights community. The answer has to be a resounding no. The extreme selectivity of the UN Human Rights Council resolutions and the avoidance of the rich and the powerful in its exhortations has made these resolutions all but meaningless. Serious and repeated violations of internationally agreed human rights standards by certain countries tend to escape the attention of the Council, while others get targeted regularly. No country quakes in its boots at the prospect of a Council resolution being adopted against it. Many members of the HRC could not understand why Sri Lanka spent so much time, energy, and resources fighting the adoption of the resolution in the past, when the outcomes seemed to be obvious, and the willingness with which it co-sponsored the resolution in 2015 with such objectionable provisions. Many provisions of the 2015 resolution have gone way beyond the mandate of the Council. For example, it welcomes the government's commitment to devolve political authority by taking necessary constitutional measures, affirms the importance of participation in a Sri Lankan judicial mechanism, including the Special Counsel's Office of Foreign Judges, Defense Lawyers, and Authorized Prosecutors and Investigators, encourages the government to accelerate the return of land to civilians and end the involvement of the military in civilian activity, etc. It could be argued that the Council, established with a mandate to advance the adherence to global human rights standards, these are agreed standards and not just standards favored by a group of Western countries, had no business calling on a sovereign state which had only recently emerged from a devastating terrorist challenge to its territorial integrity, to leave all else aside and proceed to reduce its security forces from a part of its own sovereign territory, return land acquired for security reasons, or introduce constitutional amendments. And now there is pressure to do these things post-haste, fueling the goals of extremist elements. Sri Lanka's enthusiasm for co-sponsoring the resolution of 2015 may not have gone down too well with its traditional supporters. The precedent it set could be unhelpful to many. It is doubtful if Sri Lanka did itself a substantive favor either, if Sri Lanka were to renege on the commitments that it so readily undertook. It may be confronted with the wrath of the so-called international community, and it would not be surprising if the traditional supporters just turned the other way. Another issue that is pertinent is the enthusiasm with which Sri Lanka agreed to comply with the prescriptions for reconciliation recommended by external entities. as to whether these external entities, essentially the so-called international community, took the trouble to take into account the views of the entire Sri Lankan community, or only the concerns of the pressure groups operating in their own countries, is a valid question to ask. Judging by the reactions of a vocal part of the Sri Lankan community, it is doubtful that they took much pains to reflect the concerns of the majority of the people. Unfortunately, this could be a recipe for generating serious disenchantment and the releasing of uncontrollable forces, as has happened in the past. One recalls a situation resulting from the Indo-Lanka Accord. External prescriptions have hardly ever assisted a country to resolve its internal problems. Usually, a country's problems are exacerbated by blind adherence to externally prescribed cures. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.